They were meant for one pair of eyes, only Catherine's letters, written in trust, shared in confidence. But someone, somewhere, opened that vault. And when the contents reached Camilla's allies, a silent war inside the palace ignited. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it was just a whisper, a single column in a Sunday tabloid referencing something that no one should have known. A phrase lifted straight from a letter Catherine had written during a particularly vulnerable moment was echoed in print, followed by subtle jabs from unnamed palace sources, hinting at emotional fragility and misplaced trust. The palace didn't comment, but the damage had already started. Those close to Catherine said her composure cracked for the first time in years. This wasn't the usual media storm, this was something far more personal. The letters weren't official correspondence, they weren't press briefings. They were handwritten moments of truth, meant to stay behind walls, and now they were being weaponized. Inside the palace, the tone shifted. Catherine cancelled appearances without explanation. Her absence was noticeable, deliberate. William, according to palace insiders, was incandescent. He didn't lash out publicly, but behind closed doors, he demanded answers. The betrayal wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. These letters had been kept securely. Only a handful of staff were ever permitted access. Someone had crossed the line. Even more chilling was the way Camilla's allies in the media subtly spun the narrative. Stories began emerging about Catherine's increasing isolation, about generational tension and friction with tradition. These weren't random leaks. They were targeted, synchronized, and eerily timed with the press's echo of Catherine's own words. How had the Queen Consort's network gotten hold of something so sensitive? Was this a coordinated move? Or something more sinister? Trust, already frayed within the royal household, began to deteriorate into quiet suspicion. Every conversation felt recorded, every look scrutinized. Even the most seasoned palace staff walked on eggshells. Loyalty, once assumed, now had to be proven. And while the firm braced itself for the fallout, one royal, known for her silence and disdain for drama, had already begun reviewing the facts. She didn't speak at first, but she watched, listened, and prepared. But the full storm wouldn't hit until one woman known for silence chose to speak and act. She doesn't do drama, she doesn't do scandal. But when Princess Anne walked into the staff wing unannounced, she wasn't wearing duty, she was wearing fury. The Princess Royal, known for her discipline, silence, and unshakable loyalty to protocol, crossed a line she had long respected: direct intervention in a scandal that wasn't hers. But this wasn't about protocol anymore. This was personal. Catherine's pain had been aired like dirty laundry, and Anne, who had watched her niece carry the weight of the crown with quiet strength, was done standing by. She didn't ask for reports to be filtered. She didn't summon aides for polite tea. Instead, she demanded a private audience with the heads of the royal household, and without raising her voice once, laid down a command. Every access log, every digital record, every piece of internal communication involving Catherine's letters delivered to her desk, untouched, within the hour. No assistant filtered them. No secretary intercepted. Anne, who usually delegated everything beneath the level of state crisis, reviewed every line herself. When one senior advisor attempted to stall, she cut them off with a single sentence. "I want facts, not loyalty." Behind the scenes, staff said her tone could have frozen fire. She was clinical, methodical, ruthless. And then she asked the question that chilled the entire room. Who handed my niece's pain to a press team? It wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't speculative. It was a charge. Because Anne had done her own quiet digging, she knew the tone of betrayal. She had felt its sting in her youth, masked beneath diplomacy. And she recognized its signature here, disguised beneath hierarchy, buried beneath layers of permissions, but unmistakable in its cruelty. Staff exchanged glances. Names were not volunteered, but one was soon inevitable. It came not from confession, but from patterns, emails viewed outside regular hours, a printer request not accounted for, an erased record clumsily restored. Anne never flinched. Her calm only deepened, the silence between words more terrifying than any shout. She thanked the room, stood, and said only this before leaving. The Crown will clean its own house. The order was clear. The reckoning had begun, and it wouldn't take long before one name surfaced, a name Anne never expected to hear. He was invisible, efficient, and trusted until he wasn't. The moment Princess Anne's senior secretary reviewed the digital trail, everything began to unravel. For years, the assistant had operated in the shadows of Anne's famously tight-lipped office. Never in the spotlight, never crossing lines until now. Access logs pointed to a midnight retrieval of sensitive files. Not just any files, Catherine's private letters. The metadata didn't lie. They'd been opened, copied, and forwarded to an external royal address, an address linked to Camilla's communications team. When questioned, the assistant's response was thinly veiled in panic. It was a mistake. They only wanted briefing context. But Anne had no tolerance for loopholes. She called it what it was: manipulation. The kind that strips trust not just from titles but from the monarchy itself. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She simply passed the evidence to the Royal Legal Council and stepped away, leaving the weight of what came next to protocol. Meanwhile, Camilla's team issued no defense, just silence. No confirmation, no denial, just a refusal to comment. And in the vacuum of that silence, the palace began to whisper. Had Camilla known? Was this rogue overreach or sanctioned betrayal? And what would Anne, so famously neutral, do next? But as the institution paused for breath, one figure was about to shift the narrative in a direction no one expected. Not the king. Not Anne. Not even the accused. But while the assistant awaited his fate, it was Catherine's response that left the palace speechless. She didn't scream. She didn't retaliate. She wrote. And that single letter, never meant for public eyes, became the most powerful message the firm had seen in years. Catherine, in the wake of a betrayal that shook even the most seasoned courtiers, chose grace over fury. But it wasn't weakness. It was precision. The letter, hand-delivered to Princess Anne, bypassed every formal channel. It did not accuse. It did not demand. Instead, it acknowledged the betrayal as a wound, a breach of sacred trust. And yet, it held no bitterness. Only one line seared itself into the palace consciousness. In a world that has learned to wear crowns as armor, you've worn yours as a shield for others. Catherine didn't name names. She didn't need to. Her restraint spoke louder than any condemnation. It wasn't a cry for justice, it was a quiet reminder of what the monarchy was supposed to protect. Anne, stoic and iron-willed, was reportedly moved to tears. For decades, she had distanced herself from palace politics. But this letter, this unflinching faith placed in her alone, brought something back to life. The tone of the investigation shifted overnight. It was no longer just a procedural inquiry. It became a moral reckoning. Staff who had remained silent now came forward. Aides reported an air of tension around Camilla's circle, strategic absences from meetings, clipped answers in private councils. The Queen Consort, once ever present in high-level briefings, was now noticeably receding. It wasn't exile, not yet. But the walls were closing in. And while the monarchy braced for whatever came next, one thing was becoming clearer by the hour. The true weight of royal power wasn't just in titles or tradition, it was in trust. And Princess Anne had just been handed the crown of moral authority. But Anne wasn't done, and the next move would leave no doubt who held the reins behind palace walls. There was no meeting, no HR review, just a name struck off the roster by Princess Anne's pen. The dismissal shook the palace and sent a ripple all the way to Clarence House. For decades, the inner workings of the royal household operated on layers of discretion, secrecy, and tradition. But with one signature, Anne shattered the illusion that loyalty could be quietly bent without consequence. The staff member once considered a background fixture, quietly trusted and rarely questioned, was gone before lunchtime. No send-off, no damage control. The palace simply erased him. It was swift, brutal, and unflinching. Anne didn't offer an explanation to the press. Instead, she issued one internal line that echoed through the corridors like a thunderclap. This was a matter of internal integrity. And integrity isn't up for debate. Camilla's aides were furious. Whispers of overreach swirled from Clarence House, with insiders accusing Anne of using the scandal to consolidate control. But there was no public retaliation, only unease. Behind closed doors, the hierarchy was shifting. William, meanwhile, broke with protocol. In a private moment witnessed by a single senior advisor, he approached Anne and thanked her with a quiet conviction that left no room for ambiguity. "You did what no one else would," he said, and walked away. That gesture wasn't just gratitude, it was a silent realignment. When Catherine returned to public duty days later, the optics were impossible to ignore. She didn't arrive with Charles. She didn't stand beside Camilla. She walked side by side with Anne, unapologetic, composed, and quietly restored. For the public, it signaled more than recovery. It revealed an alliance forged not by bloodline, but by action. And for the firm, it served as a reckoning. No longer would silence be mistaken for acceptance, nor tradition used to shield betrayal. But this was more than a dismissal, it was a declaration of where the royal loyalties now stood. They didn't resign, they simply stopped showing up. One by one, Camilla's inner circle began to thin, and no one could pretend it was coincidence. These weren't noisy exits or scandalous headlines. These were quiet, calculated disappearances, a communications director reassigned to a foreign post, a long-time advisor sent on extended leave. A palace scheduler moved to a different royal household with no public acknowledgement. To the outside world, it looked like minor administrative shuffling. But inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, it was a surgical unraveling. Internal communications began to surface, tone-shifted emails, clipped responses, missed briefings. A pattern emerged. Key staffers no longer included in core meetings. Words like transition, restructuring, and loss of alignment began appearing in senior-level memos. Though no one dared say it aloud, the message was unmistakable. Camilla's grip was loosening, and she knew it. Palace sources whispered of a consort fighting shadows, battling narratives she couldn't see, facing loyalties she could no longer command. Charles, as ever, remained silent. He refused to address the personnel changes, even as questions mounted. For some, that silence was loyalty. For others, it was abdication. But the void he left behind was quickly being filled. The cameras that once hovered around Camilla began to drift toward Catherine's poised return, toward Beatrice's principled rise, and most pointedly, toward Anne, whose mere presence now carried an unspoken authority. The press noticed. Headlines shifted tone. Commentators stopped asking, "What is Camilla doing?" and started wondering, who is really in charge now? Rumours swirled of a generational realignment of the crown slowly, subtly preparing to pivot toward William's orbit. Yet despite the outward calm, the palace had become a battlefield without gunfire. Every absence from Camilla's staff list, every name removed from a briefing email, was a message written in silence. But no one knew what Camilla would do with her shrinking arsenal, or if she would go quietly at all. But Camilla wasn't out, not yet. And her next move would test just how far Anne was willing to go. It was supposed to be a peace offering, Camilla, extending the olive branch. But when Princess Anne walked out mid-meeting, it was clear the lines had already been drawn. In a last-ditch effort to seize control of a narrative slipping through her fingers, Camilla arranged what palace insiders would later describe as the most awkward luncheon in recent memory. It was billed as a private unity lunch. At Clarence House, no aides, no press, just two women from the heart of the firm, facing off with years of buried tensions simmering beneath every word. Anne arrived punctually, expression unreadable, posture rigid. Her tone, according to a source present only for the opening greeting, military and cold. Camilla began with pleasantries, forced and rehearsed. She made vague allusions to the weight we all carry, to how easy it is for miscommunication to spiral, but never directly addressed the betrayal that still lingered in every hallway of the palace. Anne didn't flinch. She listened, nodded once, then cut through the fog with a single devastating line. "You knew what you were doing." That sentence turned the temperature of the room to ice. Camilla blinked, hesitated, then reached for a glass of water, lips tight. She offered a hollow apology not for the leak, but for any hurt that may have come of it. What she didn't realize was that her words weren't falling on forgiving ears. And then, the final misstep. Catherine was not invited to the lunch. A move that Anne, without needing explanation, saw as deliberate, as exclusionary, as proof that this meeting wasn't about unity, it was about optics. In that moment, Anne stood. No raised voice, no theatrical exit, just the calculated, composed departure of a woman who had seen enough. Those who saw Camilla after described her as visibly shaken, standing alone at the head of a half-eaten table, her attempted truce reduced to cold dishes and unfinished tea. What was meant to be a gesture of reconciliation became an unspoken declaration of war. And yet, Anne never uttered another word about the meeting in public. She didn't need to. Her silence echoed louder than any headline. And as the silence deepened, the Queen Consort began to realize her strongest opponent wasn't her enemy. It was the woman who refused to play her game. In the wake of betrayal, it wasn't a king or a prince who restored order. It was Anne, sharp-eyed, steel-spined, and loyal beyond politics. What began as a scandal hidden in shadows became a reckoning that pulled the monarchy into a moment of clarity. And it was Princess Anne who stood at the center of that reckoning. Not by choice, but by instinct. As internal details of the palace shake-up quietly filtered to the press allegations of leaked letters, internal firings, and rising tensions between senior royals, the public didn't recoil. They rallied. For the first time in years, support swung in a direction no one had forecast. Not toward the throne, not toward the consort, but toward the quiet force who had never once asked for attention. Princess Anne. Editorials hailed her as the monarchy's moral compass, a woman unbothered by pageantry, yet willing to protect the very heart of the crown. Her sudden influence wasn't announced, it was observed. Catherine, Beatrice, and William were seen more frequently in her company, meeting with aides, attending briefings, walking into council meetings not with ceremony, but with purpose. Behind closed doors, Anne was handed more operational oversight. Her authority in staffing and strategy quietly expanded. Not a coronation, but a confirmation. Even Charles, reportedly exhausted by the emotional strain, was heard saying to a senior advisor, "Anne cut where I couldn't." And that, more than anything, revealed the shift underway. There was no formal statement, no royal memo, but Camilla's calendar changed. Appearances dwindled. Official duties were postponed under the careful language of a rest period. Behind the palace gates, the message was unmistakable. The Queen Consort had stepped back, and Anne had stepped forward not with ceremony, but with clarity. Her actions weren't about vengeance. They were about values. In a world that often rewards silence over principle, Anne had chosen to speak through consequence. And the crown, for all its ancient symbolism, had been forced to evolve just a little more honest, just a little more human. But the story doesn't end in silence, it ends in transformation. Every monarchy is tested. And sometimes, it's not battles or borders that define the crown, but the quiet courage of one royal who refuses to let loyalty die. What began as whispers behind velvet doors has now become a sweeping recalibration of power inside the palace. The official statement from Buckingham was brief, almost sterile. A restructuring of internal protocols, a modernization of privacy safeguards, a commitment to strengthening the bonds of trust within the royal household. But beneath those diplomatic lines was a seismic shift, and at the heart of it was Princess Anne. In the aftermath of the scandal that exposed the leaking of Catherine's private letters, the monarchy didn't just issue apologies, it made promises. Catherine's privacy protocols were torn down and rebuilt from the ground up, and Anne was given authority to oversee the very structures that failed her niece. Camilla, once a strategic force in royal operations, quietly receded into a purely ceremonial role. No press releases, no headlines, just an absence that spoke volumes. And then, almost as if rising from the rubble of loyalty betrayed, Beatrice emerged, not loud, not defiant, but steady. Her inclusion in key inner-circle conversations wasn't announced, it was earned, moment by moment, decision by decision. Within the family, William was said to have raised a glass at a private gathering and simply said, "To my aunt for doing what none of us had the courage to do." It wasn't flattery, it was fact. Anne's leadership had redrawn the lines of allegiance not with war, but with principle. And when she finally stepped before cameras for the first time since the dismissal, her words didn't seek attention, they carried weight. "This is not a victory," she said. "It's a promise kept." That single sentence echoed across a nation grappling with what the monarchy should mean in an era defined not by tradition, but by trust. Because for all the titles, jewels, and ceremony, Anne had shown that the true measure of royalty isn't pageantry, it's protection, of legacy, of loyalty, of each other. Because in this family, loyalty isn't assumed by blood, it must be guarded, defended, and earned. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.